Thank you very much for a kind introduction, and thank you all for coming this morning. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I've done during my career and some of the challenges that I've faced. And as Sue said, I think it doesn't really matter what area you're working in. The challenges are broadly similar for all women and men, actually. Life's pretty tough these days and very competitive. So I started off at Oxford and then was very lucky to get a job in the city. I actually wanted to be an actress originally, and when I was 17 I had an audition at RADA just down the road from here. And the principal of RADA said to me, you also have a place at Oxford, go to Oxford, do lots of acting and then come back. So I went to Oxford, did lots of acting and somehow ended up in the city, and I'm not sure how that really happened. But it was quite a different place then. We're talking about 30 years ago, and the American banks weren't really here in any meaningful way. And it was all about the English merchant banks, of which there were 13. And I applied to the merchant banks and I got final interviews at 3 of them. 2 of them were very, very old banks, hundreds of years old, Barings and Rothschilds. And the third was a bank called Warburg's, which had been established after the war by a Jewish refugee and had shot to the top of the pile, had become the best. So I went along to my interviews, and at Barings and Rothschilds there were 10 people being interviewed. 9 were men, 1 was a woman, me. The guys had all been to Eton and Winchester. We had all been to Oxford and Cambridge. When I went to Warburg's for my final interview, there were equal numbers of men and women. They came from all over the world. Some of them had just done 1 BA, others had done MBAs and DPhils and God knows what else. So there was a very wide range of people. And just from the experience of the interview, I could see why it was that that bank had become the #1 bank in such a relatively short space of time. So when I was offered a job by Warburg's, I was completely over the moon because I knew that that was the best place to go. And also I could just sense that it was truly meritocratic. So I started off on the graduate training scheme, which involved being moved around to the 4 departments of the bank, and in those days the banks weren't nearly as sophisticated as they are now. So there was fund management, there was banking, there was what was called international, which issued a few euro bonds, and then there was corporate finance, which did mainly mergers and acquisitions of companies. And I was put into fund management as my first port of call, and I was meant to spend 6 months there and then spend 6 months in each of the other departments. So it was a 2-year training scheme. So I went to fund management and I sat there for 6 months, and I loved it so much that I said I want to stay here. And they said, no, you can't, you've got to move on, you've got to go to the banking department. And I said, well, in that case, I'll leave. So they said, okay, fine, we'll make an exception and you can stay in fund management. So as a result, I became the youngest director ever at Warburg's when I was 28. But that was sort of by the way. But anyway, shortly after they'd agreed that I could stay, I was walking past the desk of this guy who was the iconic fund manager of his generation in the City of London, a guy called Leonard Lisht. And Leonard, I'd never spoken to him before, asked me to go and do something for him. He said, could I go downstairs to the ground floor, and we were on the 4th floor, and collect a piece of paper for him. And the lifts were really dodgy. We were in an old sort of 1960s building. So I ran downstairs as fast as I could, got the piece of paper, ran back upstairs and gave it to him. And he said, no one's ever done anything so fast for me ever. You will work for me. So that's how I came to work for the iconic fund manager in the City of London. It was all about delivering 1 piece of paper. So everybody said to me, are you really sure you want to work with him? He's a very, very difficult guy. He's got a terrible temper. He throws tantrums every 5 minutes. And I said, well, my mother's Polish and I'm used to that. So I'll be fine. So that then started a partnership which lasted 8 years. Leonard was brilliant, as I said, but he was absolutely no good at running his bit of the business and absolutely no good at promoting himself. And so at a very early age, I was given the opportunity to basically run a business within a much bigger business. And because he was so talented and successful, what tended to happen was that the funds that weren't doing terribly well were passed to Leonard, or the very big funds where it was really difficult to make them do well. And so, for example, we ran the British Railways Pension Fund, the BBC Fund, GEC's fund. So we were running some of the largest pension funds in the country. And the theory was that if you had a very large fund, it couldn't perform, it was impossible, it was just too big. And so what we did was to say, look, if we pick 20 stocks in the UK market that we think are outstanding prospects, so it's a very concentrated portfolio, maybe we can prove that it's possible for large funds to outperform. And so that's what we did. And not only that, but when you look at the stock market, it's split up into sectors. So we decided that we were going to look at the sectors and in some cases take quite large bets in inverted commas. So for example, the retail sector at that stage was only 5% of the market. But Mrs. Thatcher had come along and she had removed credit controls, and Ralph Halpin at Burton has done this first sale and lease back of a store and generated some capital which could then be ploughed into new stores. And we thought that the retail sector was going to be really exciting. So instead of having 5% of our portfolios in retail, we had 25% of our portfolios in retail, which then doubled over the following 12 months. So as a result, the trustees of the Railways Pension Scheme, the BBC Pension Scheme, the GEC Pension Scheme and all the others thought we were geniuses because we'd made so much money for them, and we had proved that it was possible for a large fund to outperform. I then said to Leonard, well, if we can do so well with large funds, we could do well with smaller funds. So we could go out and promote ourselves and say, this is how we do it. We select our 20 favourite stocks, we take these very large sector bets, and we're going to charge a much higher fee than everybody else, and we're going to ask for a performance fee. So he said, brilliant, go out and do it. So I went out and did it. And as a result, we built our business extremely rapidly, and it became one of the largest parts of Mercury Asset Management, which was the asset management bit of Warburg's, and in addition, the most profitable, because we have much higher fees and we have these performance fees. One of the problems with working with somebody who is iconic is that you very soon become known as the bag carrier and seen as the bag carrier, and it's quite difficult really to progress. And although I was really well looked after financially and promoted every year, and as I said, became a director at the age of 28, I knew that if I was going to establish my own identity, I was going to have to leave Warburg's and go and do something else. And that was really very traumatic, because this guy Leonard was, had been so kind and nice to me, and I got on so well with him that I found it very, very hard to do that. But I was just sort of weighing up in my mind how I was going to go about leaving when somebody approached me, a headhunter approached me and asked me if I would go to Morgan Grenfell, which was Warburg's biggest rival, and run their fund management business in the UK, which had been a disaster. Over the previous 3 years, it had gone from 10 billion under management to 4 billion under management, and it was heading for the ground extremely fast. And so what I was being asked to do was to go and turn that business around. And this is when I was 30 years old. So I was sort of a bit nervous, and I thought, well, if they think I can do it, maybe I can. So I said, okay, fine, I'll go and try that. And it was very, very traumatic telling Leonard that I was going to leave. We both ended up crying, and actually I continued crying for 2 days after that because it was really sad and I was going to really miss him. We are still very good friends to this day though. So anyway, I went off to Morgan Grenfell, and it was really like trying to catch a falling knife. It was so bad. And it was made worse by the fact that the people at the top of the organisation wouldn't really let me do anything to change things. They expected me to sort of come in and somehow turn things around without making any changes. So I sat there for a year, sort of contemplating what I was going to do, and eventually I had to say, right, you're not letting me do anything. Things have got worse. We've now gone from 4 billion down to 3, and I think this business is going down to 0 pretty soon. So unless you let me make changes, I'm going to leave. And so they then said, okay, fine, you can make some changes. So what I did was I removed the top layer. There were a whole lot of sort of older guys who really didn't have a very good work ethic and seemed to think that they could just sort of swan around having very long lunches and not really doing that much work. So they went, and the younger guys that were there were promoted. And what they had was people over here doing research and people over here managing the money, and I don't approve of that. I think it's much better for everybody to do both. It's very important that the ideas are generated by the team Otherwise you get stockbrokers coming in, and I regard them as the enemy, and they come in and start pushing ideas, and of course they're pushing the ideas because they want commission, and they want you to turn your portfolios over as much as possible and generate as much turnover so that they make more commission. So they were the enemy. So I said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to be one team, and we're all going to do research, and we're all going to find the ideas together, and we're going to build our portfolios together, and we're going to turn this business around. And it literally turned on a sixpence. From the moment that I made those changes, the performance started going like that. And as the performance rose, people started to give us money rather than take it away. So we went from 3 billion to 22.5 billion in the following 4 years. And at that stage, there were 4 big fund managers in the City of London, which included names like Schroders and Gartmore. And suddenly people started talking about the big 5 and included Morgan Grenfell in that. So I was really proud of what I and the team had achieved there, and I should stress that it was very much the team. I was the leader, I was the person who gave them the vision, but it was very much them that actually drove that business forward and turned it around. And in many cases, they've been there for a long time in that organisation, which had been failing, but then they were suddenly in an organisation that was succeeding. Everybody wants to work for an organisation that is succeeding, and the pride that people had as that business turned around and grew was palpable to see. Everybody was smiling and they felt proud to say that they worked for Morgan Grenfell. So in 1997 there was then a bit of a debacle in that there was a fund manager in Morgan Grenfell who was a European fund manager, not a UK fund manager, and he worked in the international business, not the UK business. So he had nothing whatsoever to do with me. And he had driven a massive hole in the side of one of our unit trusts. It was our flagship unit trust, a 1.2 billion European unit trust, and we suddenly had a £450 million hole in the side of it. I won't go into the ins and outs, but it was basically a sort of fraudulent type activity that had caused this. And at that stage, fortunately, Morgan Grenfell was owned by Deutsche Bank, the German bank. If it hadn't been, it would have gone bust, and it would have been another Barings because of this terrible thing that had happened. My boss was removed, and I then found myself very much in the firing line, even though I had nothing to do with any of this, and indeed was actually on maternity leave when it actually happened. So I came back from maternity leave, tried to sort of hold the fort, tried to pull everything back together, and they decided, because I was a 36-year-old woman with several children, they decided that I wasn't quite ready to lead the business, and they brought a guy in from another bit of the bank and put him in over my head. This resulted in quite a lot of tension and upset and conflict, and most people deferred to me, came to me, wanted me to help them sort things out. And this guy had put himself in an office, whereas I sat in open plan with the team. He used the service lift to get to this office. He didn't have anything to do with anybody on a day-to-day basis, and then wondered why it was that everybody wanted to talk to me rather than him. Anyway, ultimately, it ended up with him suspending me and accusing me of trying to take a team of people to another bank. It was true that I had been approached by another bank, but it wasn't true that I was planning to leave. And so I was absolutely furious and really cross. Anyway, I was sent home, so I thought, well, what am I meant to do now? And the next thing, and he told me that this was a Tuesday, he told me to come back on Friday and we would discuss it. And he suggested I got legal advice. So anyway, I went to see a lawyer on the way back home, and he said, well, I can't do anything till I have your contract and your staff handbook, neither of which I had with me. So I went home, and then the next thing that happened was that the telephone rang. And I picked up the phone, and it was a friend of mine who I was at school with, university with, and had worked with in the city. And she said, I'm so sorry about what's happened. And I said, what do you mean you're sorry about what's happened? And she said, well, I hear that you're leaving Morgan Grenfell. And I said, well, how do you know? And she said, it's on my Reuters screen. So I said, that's interesting. So then I got called by my mother and father because my grandmother had read it in the Evening Standard and had then told my parents. Then the doorbell rang, and it was the Financial Times, and then there were the Times and the Independent and the Mail and the Sun, and the BBC appeared with a massive van with satellite dishes on top of it. And the next thing I knew, I was incarcerated in this house in Kensington with no escape because it was a terraced house. And every time anybody moved in the house, a whole lot of blue bulbs flashed. So I had to draw the curtains, and it was horrific. So, and anybody who's ever lost their job will tell you it's actually a very traumatic experience, and the last thing you want is for the entire world to know about it. So anyway, I then went to see a QC, and he was called Charlie Faulkner. He's now Lord Faulkner. He's a Labour peer. And he gave me very good advice. He said, look, clearly you've been constructively dismissed. Clearly you have a really good case, and we could go to court and win. But that will cost many hundreds of thousands of pounds. And what's more, it's going to take probably, about 18 months. And that will then leave you completely in limbo for those 18 months. So his advice to me was to just put it to one side, go home, wait for the phone to ring, do something else, and prove to the world that Morgan Grenfell, Deutsche Bank and everybody else were wrong. So I took that advice, and I went home, and 12 people called me. And my old boss, who'd been pushed out as a result of the Peter Young affair, had 12 approaches. So we had 24 different prospects. And we then came down to 2 that we liked. One was a big American bank, one was a French bank. The French bank was offering us 30% of the equity if we set up a business for them, so we decided we would do that. So we went to work for Société Générale, and we set up their business. And they gave us a target of 5 billion in 5 years, and we got to 5 billion in 2 years and 7 billion in 3 years. And they then started panicking because they were worrying about how much the 30% was going to be worth. So they then went into this long negotiation with us about buying us out. So I spent the whole of 2001 negotiating with them, and we eventually, on the 16th of November, so the anniversary is coming up very shortly, did a deal with them and sold our 30% back to them. And they then gave us loan notes and still wanted us to go on managing the business, but I got pretty fed up pretty quickly because they started interfering in a major way. So in 2003, I told them I was going to leave and that I was finally going to set up my own fund management business. And they would not accept my resignation, so it was a very odd situation. So this was in May 2003. And they kept saying, no, sorry, we don't accept your leaving. So it was very odd. So this went on till August. Then in August, I thought I'll stop going to work and maybe they'll accept that I'm leaving. And their response was to put things in the newspaper about how I was now going to be a special advisor to one of the guys in Paris and how pleased they were about this. It was all very odd. Anyway, so eventually I persuaded them in October 2003 that I was actually leaving. And they then said that I had to have 12 months of garden leave, so I had to go home for 12 months. And then I agreed with Sir Derek Higgs, who was a very prominent figure in the city, that we were going to set up this new business together called Bramdean Asset Management. I was going to be the CEO, he was going to be the chairman. And we then launched Bramdean at the beginning of 2005 after my long period of garden leave had come to an end. And we then decided that we were going to go into alternative investing and do all sorts of exciting things, which we did. Very sadly, Derek died suddenly in 2008. And so in 2009, I sold that business to Aberdeen Asset Management because I had to sort of sort out the money side of it and for his family. And I then set up a business called Rockpool Investments, and I'm now the chairman of that. And that's a private equity business that finances various types of businesses. We do anything from rolling out restaurant chains. We're rolling out something called Chicago Rib Shack at the moment, to building crematoria. We're just about to start building our second crematorium. So it's really interesting and different. But meanwhile, I was married and I had lots of children. And this whole sort of question of whether you can be a mother and whether you can work is a very major one. And obviously it is possible because I did it. And I got married when I was really young. I was only 23. I met my husband at Oxford, and I had my first baby when I was 25. So by that stage I was working for Leonard, and I already had a fair degree of responsibility. Fortunately, Leonard's wife worked. She was a barrister, and they had 2 children, so he sort of thought it was possible. He didn't even question it. So he was quite happy that I was going to go on maternity leave and come back. And I then had a second baby, and he seemed still happy with that. And then when I got to the third, he started saying, "Are you sure you're going to be able to cope with this?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." And I came back and it was all fine. But the really desperate and terrible thing that happened was that when my first child was 2 and my second child was 10 months old, my first child, Georgie, started to look really unwell. And I was very, very concerned about this, and I kept going to our local GP practice, which was a large practice in Wandsworth with 10 doctors. And I must have seen every single doctor in that practice over the course of 2 or 3 months. And they all kept treating me like a neurotic idiot and telling me there was nothing wrong with her and there was probably just a virus and she would be fine. And things just got worse and worse, and she was really unwell. And eventually, 6 months after I first thought, well, no, not quite 6, 5 months after I first thought that there was something wrong, I was saying to one of my neighbours, you know, I'm really concerned about Georgie, she's really not well, nobody will believe me. And she said, well, I have a private doctor on Sloane Street, why don't you go and see him? So I went to see him, and he said the same. He said, you know, it's a virus, she'll be fine, it's okay. We then went away on holiday for a few days, and during those few days, Georgie was incredibly listless, sleeping the whole time. She was completely white. She had bruises all over her. Her gums were bleeding when I brushed them, her teeth. And, you know, I mean, frankly, I'm not a doctor. Nobody in my family has any medical experience whatsoever, apart from my third daughter, who's now training to be a doctor here at UCL. But in those days, there was nobody in my family who had any medical experience. But even I, you know, having no medical experience, was thinking, these are clear symptoms. Why doesn't anybody believe me? What the hell is wrong with these people? Anyway, I went back to the same doctor in Sloane Street when we got back from our holiday, and I had to carry Georgie because she was so unwell. And they said, oh, we're really sorry, we don't have any appointments for 2 days, come back in 2 days. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not leaving until somebody sees my child, and I want a blood test and I want it now. And it got rather heated, and I started to shout at this because I was so desperate by this stage. And it's very unlike me to shout at anyone. So anyway, one of the other doctors in that practice heard me shouting and came out and said, what's going on? I said, look at my child. No one will believe me. Please help me. There's something desperately wrong with her. Please, please help me. And he sent us for an immediate blood test. She was diagnosed with leukemia that day. We were hospitalised that evening, and the next morning she started chemotherapy. And I thought that was certain death. I knew nothing about medicine, as I said. But then they said, well, actually, you know, leukemia is a success story. And at that stage, I mean, we're talking about a very long time ago, this was 1989, the success rate was 60%, today it's over 90%. But, you know, they said that girls did better than boys, that her white count wasn't that high, that the prognosis was actually really good. And so we had 9 weeks of treatment, then we had radiotherapy at Bart's. Rather weirdly, we ended up in a private, because I'd gone to this private GP, we ended up at the Portland Hospital of all places having this treatment, which seemed very weird to me. I actually subsequently got very concerned about whether we had the right people treating her, and I called up the Leukemia Research Fund, and they said, well, it sounds very odd. And the guy who founded the Leukemia Research Fund introduced me to the professor at Great Ormond Street, who very kindly then took Georgie on as a patient and looked at everything that had happened and said it seemed appropriate, so it was fine. But from then on, she became a Great Ormond Street patient. So we then had a period of time where everything was fine. Georgie had all her chemotherapy, she was in remission, her hair was growing back, she had gone back to school, I'd gone back to work. It seemed as though we were on a path to recovery. And then when Georgie was 8, we went skiing on a family holiday, and she suddenly started to become unwell. And I got really worried, and I called the doctor in the ski resort, and he said, well, there's not much I can do up a mountain, you'll have to go to Great Ormond Street when you get back. So we went to Great Ormond Street, and she had a blood test, and they then said the systems are down, but she looks fine, go home, it'll be fine. So we went home, and a few hours later they called to say that actually it didn't look fine, and that she had relapsed. And that was completely inexplicable after all that period of time, because generally speaking, children don't relapse after that length of time, and it just seemed very odd, but anyway, that's life. So we then embarked upon more treatment, and then we had 4 years of complete horror. First of all, they got Georgie back into remission. They used a drug called epirubicin, which is quite a fierce drug, and Georgie had a very bad reaction to it. and in that it so comprehensively destroyed her immune system that she ended up getting something called necrotizing fasciitis. And as a result of that, she very nearly died. She was given a 10% chance of coming back from the operating theatre when they took her down to remove the infected flesh. Fortunately, it wasn't on a limb, it was on her right buttock, 2/3 of her right buttock and 1/3 of her left buttock. They cut it all away. They gave her a colostomy, and miraculously, she actually survived all of that and was sent back from the operating theatre, not to intensive care as they had predicted, but actually to the ward. And she was then put on an air bed. They had to take her downstairs to the theatre and give her general anaesthetics every day for 7 days to keep cleaning the wound. They had to sew all the dressings actually to her body, and then eventually they grafted it. She was in agony, as you can imagine, so she was on very heavy doses of morphine. And as she lay there as a little 8-year-old child, she said to me, "Mummy, how can there be a God if he makes a little girl like me suffer like this?" And I couldn't really answer that. So anyway, miraculously she recovered. She became emaciated because she was on this airbed for about 6 weeks, and eventually she was well enough to go home, and she said, "I want to go to school." And I said, "Well, you can barely walk. How can you go to school?" And she said, "I want to go to school. I want to go tomorrow." So I called up the school and I said, "Georgie would like to come to school, but she can't really walk." And it was a sort of typical London school with sort of 6 stories and millions of stairs. And the headmistress said, "Don't worry, we'll look after her, that's fine." So she went back, and on the way we stopped at the wig shop in Paddington. Georgie had the most beautiful coloured hair. It was like spun gold. It was strawberry blonde. The problem with National Health Service wig shops is that you can either have blonde or dark. So they said, "Right, okay, well, we don't have the right colour, but you can have one of each." So she had 2 wigs, one blonde, one brunette. So she went off to school, blonde one day and brunette the next, and very quickly got sick of that because it was itchy and hot and no one recognised her. But within days, she was running up and down the stairs. Everybody was perfectly happy to look after her, and then she suddenly started putting on weight again, and very soon she looked like my old Georgie. So anyway, that was fine. She then had another episode of necrotizing fasciitis when they gave her epirubicin for a second time, even though they gave her a lower dose later that year, but it wasn't as severe. So we ended up in hospital for another few weeks. Anyway, eventually, it all seemed to be working and she seemed to be okay. So by this stage, she was 11, and it was the day of the Carol concert in 1997. 1997 being the year that I'd been through the whole Peter Young affair and been, sort of pursued by the press for God knows how many weeks and everything else. So the same year, and my father had died suddenly that year as well. So anyway, we get to the 5th of December, and it's the Carol concert, and we're going for a routine checkup at Great Ormond Street, and for some reason the systems are never normally down. They were down again. And so we didn't actually get the results. So we then went to the Carol concert. Georgie did a reading beautifully, and it was all fine. And we went home, and there was a message on our answer phone at home saying, "Could I call Great Ormond Street?" And Georgie had relapsed again. This time, the only way she was going to be saved was to have a bone marrow transplant. And we were lucky because there were 2 donors. One was a man, one was a woman. They preferred the man. Women aren't very good donors, apparently, especially when they've had children. So there was a man who was prepared to do it in Bristol, very kindly. I wasn't allowed to know who he was. He wasn't allowed to know who we are. I sort of wonder whether he knows that it was us, but anyway. So then I sent him a letter anonymously and a large, very, very large box of chocolates, because in those days, I think it's not quite so severe now what they do, but in those days you had to have a general anaesthetic and an enormous needle stuck in his hip and all the marrow drawn out. And, so it was a real act of kindness and compassion that he actually donated his bone marrow to Georgie. So she had her bone marrow transplant. And it is a horrific process, as I'm sure some people in this room will know. So you have to have total body irradiation, which she had at the old Middlesex Hospital. And then you get stuck in a room for 10 weeks in isolation. I had to sort of cut my hair really short. I couldn't wear any jewellery. If I did leave the room, which I didn't terribly often, I then had to change before I came back. And it was all dreadful for Georgie. She got, this thing where the inside of your mouth gets burned from the radiation, and then your gut, and then you have, all sorts of terrible pain, so she had to have morphine again, and so on and so forth. Then she got something really awful called hemorrhagic cystitis, which involved peeing out blood clots the size of kidney bowls several times a day. And this went on for quite a while, and nobody seemed to know what to do about it, and she was literally about to die as a result of that. So I got hysterical and was screaming at them and saying, you've got to find a solution for this. So they rang up everybody in Britain who might know about it, and Bristol said, if you give her low-dose estrogen, sometimes it works, and we don't know why. So they gave her low-dose estrogen. The hemorrhagic cystitis continued for another 7 days, and at the end of 7 days, suddenly her pee was clear. So it actually worked. So that was incredible. So miraculously, after this sort of 10 weeks of hell, we came out the other side of it. But unfortunately, by this stage, Georgie's body was really over-treated, and she was in a pretty bad way. Her kidneys didn't really work, and her bowel didn't really work, and she had graft versus host disease and constant diarrhea. She couldn't eat, she had to be fed intravenously. But she didn't have any leukemia in her body, it had gone, and she only had the graft, the bone marrow. She didn't have any of her bone marrow. So she didn't have leukemia, at least. Anyway, for several months she battled away, trying to overcome all of these things. And then she got something called aspergillus, a fungal infection in her ear. And I knew then that it wasn't very likely that she was going to survive, that if you have an aspergillus in your body, you are probably going to die. And shortly after that, it went on to her lungs. She ended up on a life support machine. They tried everything they could to save her. They imported drugs from Belgium, experimental drugs. I got healers. We did everything that was humanly possible to try and save her. Great Ormond Street were absolutely wonderful because, it was quite clear that she wasn't going to live, but they left her on the life support machine for a few days so that we could come to terms with it. And one thing that really, really touched me was that during that period of 3 or 4 days, 60 members of staff from Great Ormond Street Hospital went through that room to say goodbye to Georgie. And they were nurses, and they were doctors, and they were cleaners, and they were the woman who ran the shop, and the professor, Judith Chessels, who had taken Georgie on as a patient when we had come from the Portland Hospital all those years ago. Judith came into the room, and Georgie was intubated and heavily sedated, and therefore out of it. But Judith spoke to Georgie as though she was sitting up in bed, and she said, Georgie, you are one of the bravest people I have ever met in my life. You have had to endure some of the most horrific things, and you have never complained. You have always kept smiling, and I will never forget you. And she then put a little cross on Georgie's head and walked out of the room. So you can imagine that was pretty difficult. So anyway, the day came when we had to turn the life support machine off, and I got our local vicar to come, and he said a few words, and there were 14 people in the room, and that included obviously me and my husband and one of our children, the child who's becoming a doctor, and I think maybe that's why she is becoming a doctor. And then various godparents, my granny, who was about 83 at the time, who just cried and cried and cried and said, it's so unfair, I'm old, why wasn't it me, why was it her? But again, how can you answer those questions? So anyway, I had my arms around Georgie and they turned the machine off, and everybody else sort of had their arms around me, so it was like a sort of large group hug. And I was thinking, they've made a terrible mistake, she's breathing normally, it's all going to be fine. And then there was a deep shudder, and then life had left Georgie's body. And the reason that I'm telling you this is because, it's really important that women should succeed, that we should all be successful in our careers. But please don't forget how important family is. So many women these days delay having children and often forfeit having children as a result because of their careers. The one thing that hasn't changed is our bodies, unfortunately, and there is only a certain time span for having children. I am the luckiest person ever because I was Georgie's mother. Judith Chessels was right. She was the bravest person that I've ever met. And, you know, whenever people say to me, how many children do you have? That's a very awkward question because do I say 6 or do I say 5? I always say 6. And, you know, my proudest achievement was to have given birth to Georgie. And I remain very proud to have been her mother. So thank you.